Hi, I'm Derek Ashong, and you are now in the stream. Today, has the once liberal-leaning country of Canada gone conservative? Latoya Peterson, editor of racialicious.com, a blog that covers race and culture, is here looking out for your live feedback. Twitter using the hashtag AJStream. Joining her on the couch today is Peter Van Prague, president of the Halifax International Security Forum. Welcome, Peter. Tell us what the forum does.
Oh, thanks so much, Derek. It's great to be here. Halifax is a forum and a network that brings leaders together to consider issues related to international security. And I'm happy to be here today to talk about Canada and not only its point of view on issues related to international security, but what's going on up north in any case. And you know, here we are in Washington, D.C., but it feels a little bit like Canada outside.
It feels very much like Canada outside. That's why I'm extra bundled up. But it's a pleasure to have you here. Looking forward to your insights.
Good to be here.
For sure. And as always, as we say, this show is about you, our community. Remember, you can follow all of our updates from the stream right at our Facebook page. We're going to be posting video clips and content from the latest shows right there. So stay tuned because Latoya's actually got some of your feedback coming up right now.
In Nigeria, embattled President Goodluck Jonathan may have dropped the straw that broke the camel's back in the form of removing the fuel subsidy. Nigerian citizens continue to demonstrate for a third straight day, and labor unions are calling for a national strike. At least one death has been reported, but the protests are only gaining momentum. Against this backdrop, Occupy Nigeria is gaining steam. Twitter user @Gabenga says, someone ought to tell NLC and TUC that this Occupy Nigeria is much more than fuel subsidy removal. We demand an end to plutocracy, no more. And Wale writes, unemployment plus high pump price plus unavailable power supply plus double taxation plus corruption equals insecurity. Hashtag Occupy Nigeria, hashtag fuel subsidy. Our community tells us that the local media has not been covering the protest. So the stream is planning to devote one of our upcoming shows to the situation in Nigeria. So please keep sending us in your live tips, photos, and on-the-ground reports. Another tip points us toward a brewing scandal in Singapore. The 2011 elections acted as a referendum on ministerial salaries, with a committee recommending that the president of Singapore take a 51% pay cut. Some citizens were still not satisfied with the cuts, saying that the proposed salaries were still too high. Kinman Lee says, with the proposed ministerial pay cuts, our leaders have gone from obscenely well paid to just well paid. Poor things. And Twitter user Real Singaporean notes, after the minister pay cut, the easiest way to become a millionaire in Singapore is still to join politics. Others tried to use humor as a way to represent their feelings. So we have this great picture of President Obama, who's been Singapore-fied, saying, Walae, the Singapore president and PM still make more money than me after a pay cut le. Sian half. Remember, you can send us your questions and comments using the hashtag AJStream. Many of you are already doing this, so let's take a look at a live visual showing the pictures of some of the users who are tweeting us right now.
Canada has often been described as a country with liberal policies, but that may not be the case anymore. Critics accuse Prime Minister Stephen Harper's Conservative Party of moving the country sharply to the political right. Since winning the 2006 election, Harper's government has shifted Canada's policies on issues like the environment, immigration, and foreign policy, to name a few. Domestically, Harper's spending has been viewed critically by opponents. Take a look at this chart by the group Enough's Enough, which has been campaigning against him. Under the Harper government, Canada has spent $29.3 billion to purchase and maintain 65 F-35 fighter jets, which some say is the most costly weapons program in the nation's history. He also spent $9.5 billion to upgrade the prison system, even though crime rates in Canada are on the decline. And he's continued to give corporations tax breaks. Many Canadians are angry with the political direction of the country. Prior to the May 2011 general elections, Canadians went online to post their complaints about Harper's government. Let's take a look at what some of them had to say.
The
moment when I had enough of the Harper government was when I realized they were more willing to spend money on fighter jets than on culture.
I decided I'd had enough of the Harper government when Canada lost its bid for the UN Security Council seat for the first time in the UN's history.
The moment I had enough of the Harper government was when I watched the government gutting systematically funding to women's issues.
The moment that I had enough of Stephen Harper was when he began to say to any kind of problem that came up was, Canadians don't care.
Made me think of Winston Churchill, who, when he was asked, why don't you cut money from arts to put towards war, he said, then what are we fighting for?
Now, the Conservative Party was re-elected, in fact, and actually increased their number of seats in Parliament to become a majority government. Supporters argue that Harper's government enabled Canada to weather the global recession better than most and is the only group of 7 country to have more than recovered all the jobs and economic output lost during the recession. Joining us now via Skype is Haroon Siddiqui, a columnist with the Liberal Toronto Star. Also with us is Scott Stinson, a journalist with Canada's Conservative National Post. Welcome, both of you, to the stream. I want to start with you, Haroon. Is it simply that Canada's government is shifting to the right, or are the Canadian people themselves actually moving to a more conservative position?
No, I think I would argue that it's the government that has turned right. Some of the policies that you have outlined, there are a whole host of others on the international scene as well as domestic scene and so on. Then the issue becomes, as part of your question, why is it that the Canadian public has re-elected him? And the counter-argument for that is that the opposition was so inept under the leadership of Ignatieff that most people coalesced to Mr. Harper and give him full credit that he was given full marks for running a good economy and keeping the country's economic picture much better than, as you mentioned, the other G8 countries.
Okay, well, Scott, we have an interesting tweet coming in from @CraigF on Twitter that's saying that Canada did not shift to the right, it shifted left, and the Conservatives got in on a vote split. How would you respond?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Mr. Siddiqui says in terms of the Canadian people haven't shifted dramatically right. I think he's absolutely right in terms of the politics being what happens in Canada was that there was a divided left, so to speak. You had this, what was traditionally viewed as a centrist Liberal Party and a more left-leaning NDP, and that split the vote on the left-hand side, so to speak, of the spectrum. And so as a result, the Conservatives, which have been chipping away with a minority for a number of years, finally got a majority government, which in Canadian political terms essentially means they have a bit more free rein to do what they want. They don't have to worry about being defeated by the opposition at any point.
Now, Peter, how are people responding in Canada? I mean, is this something that we're simply, you know, it's a cosmetic difference of opinion, or is there significant resistance to the government's policies?
Derek, before I answer that question, I want to just remind our viewers, because I think there are a lot of folks in Canada watching this, but there are a lot of people who are outside of Canada, around the world, who have visited Canada, who follow Canada, but are not from Canada. And I think it's important to keep in mind that politics, the body politic in Canada, is left of the United States. And so when we say that Canada has turned right or is going right, in relation to the United States, it's still pretty far to the left of, for example, what we're watching in the Republican primary.
Absolutely, but that's part of the reason we're asking these questions,
Right.
because in certain key areas, for
Right.
example, Canada's stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict,
Sure.
you've seen the Canadian government actually take a much more conservative stance, even than the Obama administration.
Right. I'm not sure on that specific issue if that is something that's conservative or liberal. I think on that specific issue, and I think, you know, and I know that there are a lot of viewers in the Middle East who follow that and do care about, you know, what Canada thinks on this issue. What I would suggest is that Canada's policies toward Israel and toward the region have not changed, and that other countries might have changed a little bit. I think Canada's policies on that are such that, well, I think what you see in that, I think it's been overblown a little bit, in the sense that governments, no matter who's governing Canada and the United States, policy toward Israel, I think, is going to always be pretty close to each other.
Okay, well, I mean, I think a point just came up actually from Twitter reflecting that same issue of Israel, and I think we should present it to Haroon.
Definitely. So from our community, Yasmin notes that that's a huge understatement. Foreign policy took the biggest hit. Harper pushed the U.S. aside to be Israel's best friend, no questions asked. And adding on to that, Jordan notes that Harper never laid out a clear foreign policy. He only has certainty of any policy is that it will support Israel.
Haroon?
Yeah, you see, two things to remember: that foreign policy rarely becomes a campaign issue in Canada, as it does not become a campaign issue in the United States unless you want to beat up the president on some points. That said, I totally disagree that the changes on Israel are cosmetic. They're not. It is not a question of whether Canada is pro-Israeli or not. We are all pro-Israeli. I mean, everyone believes in the right of Israel to succeed and to thrive and exist. All of those things go without saying. What we have had with Mr. Harper is a right-wing lurch. He supports the right-wing Likud kind of Israeli policies. The attack on Lebanon, for example, 2006, he was one of the only G7, G8 country leaders who said this was appropriate response to what was happening. Attack on Gaza, knee-jerk, full-fledged, full-throated support without any questions, without even knowing the details of what had transpired in cases of bombings. On the case of Arab Spring, for example, knee-jerk support for Hosni Mubarak and all the dictators in the name of stability. So this is more than cosmetic. This is totally right-wing kind of attitude towards Israel, and that he makes no apologies for it. Give him marks for it, but nonetheless, we cannot pretend that it is not a right-wing lurch.
Scott, what's your take on this?
I agree, certainly, that the Harper government's been very upfront with its support for Israel. They've made no bones about always wanting to sort of be side by side with Israel first and kind of ask questions later. I think historically, some of the incidents Mr. Siddiqui mentions, you might be able to say were driven by domestic policy considerations, especially in a minority government time. The Conservatives were trying to make inroads in some communities that traditionally the Liberals have done very well at domestically, i.e. ridings in Canada where there's a heavy Jewish population. So I think for a while there it was just assumed that the Harper was sort of standing side by side with Israel so that he could be seen to be a friend of the country and make some inroads back home. I think the question we're going to see in the future is, now that he has a majority and he doesn't need to worry entirely about domestic considerations, if he is so knee-jerk. The other thing I would mention too, though, is I don't think we entirely know how a liberal prime minister in some of those situations would have reacted. They've always been pretty quick to sort of stand beside Israel as well. And I don't know, I think I would maybe argue that one of the things you might see with a liberal prime minister in some of those incidents in Gaza and Lebanon, they might have tried to soften it a little of the message, but I think the main message would have been the same. They would have been standing with Israel.
Okay,
To add to what Scott has said, is that we have traditionally followed Washington's policy on Israel, and in fact have gone beyond that since dating back to Lester Pearson in 1956, that we were neutral in the Arab-Israeli dispute. Our current prime minister is not neutral, makes no apologies for it. He's entitled to do it as an elected leader, but at the same time, this is not to say that he has not lurched right. And in the case of Mr. Barack Obama, for example, he has gone to the right of Barack Obama when he said, President Obama said 1967 borders should constitute the basis for negotiations between Arab and Israelis. Mr. Netanyahu did not think so. And lo and behold, Mr. Harper departed from Washington's policy, departed from Obama, and sided with Mr. Netanyahu in scuttling this idea that 1967 borders should indeed form the basis for negotiations, which is the international consensus.
Now, I want to move on actually from Israel and Palestine for a moment to the environment and specifically the Kyoto Protocol. And we have a video question that came in from one of our viewers on that very issue.
My name is Sam Tatz and I'm calling from Toronto, Canada. I completely agree with Prime Minister Harper's environmental policies. Why should we be part of Kyoto as a country that only emits 1.8% of the world's emissions when the US emits more than 18% and has not ratified it?
Haroon, your thoughts?
Well, the thought is that we really should be dealing on a per capita basis. The counter argument is Canada is such a big country, we're a cold country, we need more heat and so on and so forth. But just to put it in perspective, Mr. Harper's position on Kyoto is exactly the same as that of George W. Bush. He questions the science of it, he does not agree with it, and they have finally come out of the closet and scuttle it completely recently.
Now, Peter, is that a fair characterization?
Well, on this issue, what I would say is that without question, Canadians pride themselves on caring about the environment, and they, I would say that to Haroon's point, that per capita, Canada emits as much as the United States, or maybe even a little bit more, I think would actually surprise most Canadians, because Canadians believe very much in protecting the environment. That and I think that on this issue is one that resonates with Canadians, and Canadians want their government to be a leader on the environment. That being said, Kyoto, I think from early on, folks knew, whether it was the Liberal government or early on in Mr. Harper's tenure, that Canada was not going to be able to meet the Kyoto requirements. And so leaving Kyoto now is actually straightforward and honest in a way, by saying that we're not going to meet Canada's not going to meet the requirements, and maybe we can build something that has Canada involved. Canada should, in my view, be a leader on this, but also include some of the big emitters, United States, China, and India among them.
Well, Scott, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, because could it be that part of the reason Canada is unable to make its Kyoto commitments is because of the increased investment in the tar sands of Alberta, and now we have this proposed Keystone XL pipeline through the United States that's actually causing a lot of concern for environmentalists even here in the U.S.?
Well, there's no doubt that the oil sands and Keystone and those kind of issues play a big role in Canada's ambivalence towards Kyoto previously, and now their outright withdrawal from it more recently. There's been a major shift in the Canadian economy in terms of away from what used to be the manufacturing bases in Ontario and Quebec and towards the resource-based industries of the West. So it's absolutely true that when Stephen Harper and the Conservatives say we're not going to meet the Kyoto commitments, it's partly because they don't want to be very damaging to the economy in the West. But the reality is, as Peter was saying, this has been the case for a long time. The Liberal government signed on to Kyoto and then didn't do anything in terms of putting new targets or new punitive measures towards emitters. And so after a number of years, they said, well, we should be still part of Kyoto, but it was already well known that Canada was never going to meet its targets. So really what they're doing is they're sort of playing catch up to something that has always been kind of on the back burner and been a fait accompli long before it actually happened.
Okay. Now, I know we have a number of other questions coming in from online. So what do you see?
It seems that our community is really concerned about the changes to social policy, particularly for the most vulnerable members of society. So we have Christina, who writes in, what about social policies under Harper, like refugees of sexual orientation?
Yes, you see, as I was saying at the beginning of the program, we have concentrated on international issues, but in domestic issues, you mentioned up front, for example, there's a kind of aping of the Republican American policy on crime and punishment. This government is spending $9.5 billion building jails for criminals who don't exist. Because we are now going through, at this point, Statistics Canada and other agencies have just finished telling us Canada has had the lowest crime rate in 25 years. And here is this government building more jails exactly the same way that the Americans used to do. And ironic thing is that even people like Newt Gingrich and so on have said that was folly, that was stupid. California didn't even have the money to keep these people in jail. We are letting them go. And here in Canada, we are following this policy on crime and punishment.
Well, let me give Scott an opportunity to respond. What's
Sure.
your comment on that issue?
Well, actually, I agree with everything he says on the crime policy stuff. This is an issue that I think crosses a lot of ideological boundaries, so to speak, in Canada, where the Conservatives have made a lot of hay about making tough on crime one of their major initiatives, and they've sort of largely ignored the fact that many people, conservative, liberal, social, Democrat, whatever you want to say, have pointed out that strictly going towards measures like mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes, these things have been tested in the United States, and they've been found to not be terribly effective at reducing crime rates. So I'm in entire agreement that this is one area in terms of crime that the Harper government has let the idea of being tough on crime, which is a vote winner, be the thing that drives their policy. The one thing I would say is that, to be honest, the Liberals and the NDP and the other opposition parties have never really gone after them on it because they've always been a little leery about being accused of being soft on crime. It's one of those issues that I think the reality is very separate from the policy on it, and as such, they've been able to have some real success in pushing that message, even though a lot of people from a lot of different places in the spectrum have disagreed with it.
So, Peter, this sounds like something. I just want to get Peter's thoughts really quickly, Harun, on this very issue. A lot of people in the U.S. complain about the question of the conservative. I'm sorry, Harun, just one moment, please. People in the U.S. complain about this issue of fear-based politics. Right. I mean, is that what's happening in Canada when you have people gaining votes off of the fear of imaginary criminals?
Well, this is what I would say about that, and I would go to Harun's first point about what's happening on the left side of the political spectrum in Canada, and that is, it's these issues that I think will Canadians do demand a certain social safety net, more so than the United States, certainly. And it is some of these issues that are going to galvanize and force the left side of Canadian politics to get better organized. And until they do that, as Scott is saying, these are winning issues. And poll after poll, and not only polls, but the election itself in May brought a majority government to Canadians. So yes, it is working. Canadians feel safer and are continuing to support these policies.
Let's get an additional thought. Harun, you wanted to make a comment briefly on this point.
No, all I was just going to say that also remember that Canada is a parliamentary democracy with a three-party system, unlike the American system. So it is not, we might end up giving the wrong impression that Canada is 49-51 on these issues. What really happens in a three-party parliamentary democracy that a government wins majority government with 39-40% of the vote. So our original point of Canadians remaining on the left of center remains valid. And especially one of the callers who mentioned social programs are being affected. We have $9.5 billion for jails that we don't need, but we don't have $10 million for English language training and so on and so forth.
Harun, hold that thought, because I want to get into some of that domestic spending issue when we go into the post show. Thanks, both of you. I want to ask for you to stay with us for just a second. And let's going to go now to some of the issues that we've been following as leads right here in the stream.
So this is the part of the show where we outline some of the developing stories that we're following. Our first lead is from Bahrain, where an English language instructor was fired from the state-run university over his Facebook comments on the country's internal unrest. Tony Mitchell says that his posts were not critical of the ruling family or government. He simply sought to correct false or misleading information. At that time, Tony was the only non-Bahraini under investigation by the Ministry of Education. Our next lead comes from Kuala Lumpur, where a newly passed law makes Wi-Fi mandatory in large restaurants, bars, and clubs. The city previously used a free Wi-Fi service, but is shifting responsibility to businesses in order to improve internet quality. And our final lead is a living neon sign that has been created at the University of California at San Diego. Let's take a little look at the video here, where it really shows the sign in action. What you're seeing flashing on the screen is called bioluminescence. And essentially, this billboard is composed of millions of naturally glowing bacterial cells that bioengineers have synchronized to light up in unison. These light-emitting organisms could one day be used to light and replace a city's streetlights. Those are our stream leads. So if you want to find out more, visit stream.aljazeera.com/leads. Cast your votes for the story that you're the most interested in and tell us what you want to see on a future show.
Thank you, Latoya. I hope I never run into any of those glowing bacteria ever under any circumstances.
They're really cool, I promise. I've seen them. So. They're really, really cool. They're not
just as long as they're not on my sandwich. Thank you, Latoya. Thank you, Harun, Scott. Thank you both. We're going to stay with you in the post show. Thank you, Peter, for being with us. We're going to continue this conversation at stream.aljazeera.com. Remember, on Thursday, we're talking about South Africa and the ANC, which is turning 100 this month. Stay with us. Tweet us using the hashtag AJStream. We'll see you online. Hi, welcome to the Post Show. We're continuing our conversation about the political trends in Canada. We're asking the question, is the nation making a substantive political leap towards the right? I want to go back to our Skype guests. And Haroon, wanted to come back to you specifically around these issues of domestic spending. What is the kind of sentiment on the ground in Canada about the domestic spending priorities of the Harper government?
You see, I think if you look at the recent polls and so on, a majority of Canadians oppose the kind of policies that the Harper government has followed, both on not only the thing that we discussed earlier, building more jails when we don't need them, a stunning amount of $9.5 billion. They have spent billions of dollars on the military, which is a matter of argument. You know, does Canada need more money on military or not? And one can argue oneself either way, that we need to have the capacity to be active in Afghanistan and so on and so forth. But on basic, simple issues of social policy, on issues of poverty, because what is happening in Canada is exactly the same thing, but not on the same scale as the United States, that the income gaps are widening in Canada. And in Canada, we prided ourselves in having a more egalitarian society, more collectivist values and support of this social safety net, and that is being tattered, and the government finds no money for it. And in fact, now we are into a huge deficit, which means that there'll be even less resources available. And the last point to be made is Mr. Harper, in agreement with the Republican Party, and in fact the loony Tea Party right, does not believe in increasing taxes. So what will happen is there'll be more cutbacks.
So actually, Scott, let me bring this to you. I'm showing on my screen right now an image that's talking about the finances of Canada. And basically, it's showing that under Liberal governments, the country was running something of a surplus. However, under Conservative government, it's moved towards deficit. Now, how much of that can be blamed on the economic crisis that affected the globe, and how much of that can be blamed on the taxation and spending policies of the current administration?
Well, if you're talking about the bulk of the deficit that the government found themselves in, I mean, it went from being in surplus to being 50 billion in deficit. The bulk of that was all due to the short-term stimulus kind of spending that everyone in every country, every Western country was doing starting in 2008. I would also say, though, that the government made some other choices in terms of cutting what's called the GST here, which is a goods and sales tax, which they've cut that by 2 points, which some economists argue put them in a deficit position, what's called a structural deficit, even before the stimulus spending happened. So I think it's actually true that this is a government that put itself in a precarious position in terms of its spending, because one thing Mr. Siki didn't mention is that in terms of program spending, it actually has continued to rise. This is a quote-unquote conservative government, and program spending has gone up and up through successive conservative government iterations. So, you know, I think they find themselves in a position now where they're trying to figure out how they're going to save money. They're going through a big spending review. And I think it'll be really interesting to see whether or not the spending cuts that they make going forward, which everyone knows they have to make, are done out of finding the fat areas in the budget, or more driven by ideology. People who are sympathetic towards the government, I think, would hope that they identify the programs that are inefficient as opposed to the programs that they don't like.
Well, we've got actually an economic question from one of our viewers.
Right, this comes from Sarah on the West Bank.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm calling from the West Bank. And I understand under Harper's rule as Canadian Prime Minister that their economy has dwindled down and that their cost of living has increased, while also their overall debt has increased to an all-time high. So my question is, does that have to do with his policies, or is that an effect of the global crash in the economy?
Peter, what do you
think
think?
Scott has already partly covered that. As Scott said, some of the money was being spent even before the 2008 crisis came about. In a broad picture way, one could say that the Harper government has been reluctant to make the cuts, have been spending money like drunken sailors. And there's a parallel here with the Bush administration. The Democrats leave them a surplus. Bill Clinton leaves the Treasury in good shape. Mr. Bush comes along, spends all the money, and creates a crisis, and there is the huge deficit. Here in Canada, Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin leave a good, clean treasury with a lot of surplus, and most of the money is gone. And here we are staring down the barrel of a huge deficit, huge debt, and also they need to find savings which are no longer there because the Harper government has used up the money for its ideological commitments to the things that we have already discussed.
So, Peter, is Stephen Harper an economic cousin to George W. Bush?
I think the issue of economics in Canada is economics and more economics and less ideology. And to answer the question that came in from the West Bank, there was a global economic slowdown, and the truth is Canada had some serious fiscal issues in the mid-1990s that scared Canadians, and as a result, the Liberal government at the time and afterwards, and then the Harper government that followed, took special measures to rein in spending. Since that time, as Scott pointed out, in 2008, everybody had to pump up spending to get things going. But Canada's economy is, yes, it's a member of the G7, but it's not as big as its neighbors here in the United States. And when the American economy slows down, Canada's economy is fundamentally affected. And when you look at some of the statistics that come out in comparison of Canada with European economies or even with the United States economy, Canada's faring much better. Still, yes, there's right now a spending review, and we'll see, as Scott points out, what exactly is going to be reviewed and what's going to be cut, and that should signal to Canadians what's happening next.
So let's get some more comments from our community, because there have been a number of things coming in.
Definitely. So Ross comes in with this really interesting perspective. Harper's Conservatives consider themselves correcting Trudeau liberalism that was entrenched into Canada's structure in the 1980s. Do you all agree with that statement? You want to start with Haroon?
No, I don't. I mean, this is in fact ideological point that Mr. Trudeau had made so many huge blunders that they need correcting. Mr. Trudeau laid the foundation of modern Canada, cosmopolitan Canada, pluralistic Canada, multicultural Canada. He could only be faulted for his economic record, which was in fact cleaned up by the Liberal governments that succeeded him, that of Jean Chrétien and Mr. Paul Martin, and they left the country in good financial shape. Now then it becomes sociological and ideological questions. The Liberal government introduced a gun registry, for example, because we do not believe, like the Americans, on the right of everyone to have guns and go shooting and killing each other. Mr. Harper ideologically has campaigned for and in fact gone ahead and done away with the gun registry. You and I may disagree on it, but this is not some huge wicked thing that the Liberals had done that Mr. Harper needs cleaning up. What needs cleaning up is the economy, and in fact he has messed it up as opposed to improving it.
Now let me go to Scott on this next question. This is coming from @SingAlleluia on Twitter, who's asking, as political values are shifting in Canada, should we expect an aggressive foreign policy like that of the U.S.?
That's actually a good question. I think the one thing you could see with the Harper government now that it has majority is the idea of picking and choosing your fights, sort of backing the people you want to back and not backing the others. When a minority government situation, it was always sort of gentle and more doing things with domestic considerations in mind. I think there is definitely a possibility that you would see Stephen Harper backing the people he thinks is valuable allies and not backing others. So if I had to guess, I'd say that's definitely a distinct possibility. We'll see that in the future.
That's right.
Cool. And from Julia, she would like to know, does the left plan to unite against Harper, and can they? Peter, do you want to weigh in?
That might be. It's a three-party. It's as Haroon pointed out, it's a three-party parliamentary system. Some would even call it a four-party parliamentary system, if you count the Quebec.
Yes.
That really is the fundamental question, and whether or not they can is really going to see sort of how Canada goes forward. It's important to remember a couple of things. The Liberal Party of Canada benefited for more than 10 years of a split conservative movement, and when the conservative movement came back together under the banner of the Conservative Party, that's what led to defeating the Liberal Party of Canada. The Liberal Party and the party that's even left of the Liberal Party, the National Democratic Party, NDP, are two distinct parties, and whether or not they come together remains to be seen. I'd be interested to see what our other guests think about that.
Haroon, what's your take?
No, you see, I mean, anytime the liberals are in government, all the people on the right say the rightists are divided, we should get united and so on. When the conservatives are in power, the leftists bemoan the fact that the left is divided and we need to come together. I am a total unapologetic supporter of a parliamentary system. It has its own built-in measures that take care of these trends and so on. There is always the possibility that the leftist party, without uniting and becoming one and becoming a two-party system like the United States, which has nothing to lend itself to in terms of credibility or governance, there is always the room in a parliamentary democracy that you could have two parties on the left joining in the voting of a certain issue in parliament. So parliamentary system does allow the kind of flexibility that people don't give it credit for, and I'm not a great fan of two-party system.
Okay, so that's another strong statement. I think we've gotten a lot of really good insight on this. One of the things I've got to say to you all is, I don't know if it's stereotypically Canadian, but this has to be one of the most civilized debates we've ever had on the stream. So I want to thank you, and I tip my hat to the North. Haroon and Scott, thank you both for your participation. Peter, thank you so much for the perspective that you offered today. And thank you as well, Latoya, for getting our community fully integrated. And finally, thank you, our community. As always, we can't do this without you. So tweet us your thoughts on this topic and more. Use the hashtag AJStream. The conversation will continue online.